It didn't begin with explosions. There were no sirens at first, no collapsing buildings, no images of chaos flooding television screens. It began with something far more dangerous. Certainty, a quiet, calculated certainty that spread through government halls, intelligence briefings, and media narratives. A certainty that felt rational, even necessary. Because in the aftermath of September 11th attacks, fear had reshaped the American psyche. It wasn't just about what had already happened. It was about what could happen next. And in that fragile moment, when a nation was still trying to understand its own vulnerability, decisions were made. Decisions that would not only define a generation, but leave behind questions that still refuse to be answered. What if the threat was misunderstood? What if the urgency was misplaced? And what if the war that followed was built on a foundation that was never as solid as it seemed? This is not just the story of a war. This is the story of a decision that continues to echo through politics, through memory, and through history itself. In the early 2000s, the United States stood at a crossroads. On one side was grief, on the other, determination. After September 11th, the concept of national security was no longer theoretical. It became immediate, urgent, and deeply personal. Government officials began reevaluating threats, not just based on evidence, but on possibility. And one name kept resurfacing: Iraq. Led by Saddam Hussein, Iraq had long been viewed with suspicion. The memory of the Gulf War still lingered. Sanctions had been imposed. Tensions never fully disappeared. But now the narrative was shifting. Intelligence reports began suggesting that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, biological agents, potential nuclear ambitions. These weren't just rumors. They were presented as imminent threats. And in a post-9/11 world, imminent meant something very different. Officials argued that waiting for confirmation could be catastrophic. Because what if the next attack wasn't preventable? What if hesitation cost lives? This was the logic that began shaping policy. The logic that made war feel not only justified, but necessary. While the public debate unfolded, critical decisions were being made behind closed doors. Inside the White House, intelligence briefings became increasingly urgent. Figures like George W. Bush and Dick Cheney were presented with reports that painted a concerning picture. But intelligence is rarely absolute. It is often fragmented, incomplete, open to interpretation. And in this case, interpretation played a crucial role. Some analysts raised doubts. They questioned the reliability of sources. They pointed out inconsistencies. But in the broader narrative being constructed, those doubts didn't carry the same weight as certainty. Because certainty moves faster. Certainty convinces. Certainty leads. And by early 2003, the decision was no longer a question of if. It became a question of when. When the invasion began in March 2003, it was unlike anything the world had seen before. The strategy was called shock and awe, a rapid, overwhelming display of military force designed to dismantle the Iraqi regime quickly and decisively. And visually it worked. Explosions lit up the night sky over Baghdad. Broadcasts captured the intensity of the assault. Within weeks, Iraqi forces were overwhelmed. Baghdad fell. Saddam Hussein's grip on power collapsed. To many observers, it looked like a textbook military success. Fast, efficient, decisive. But war is rarely defined by its opening act. Because while the regime had fallen, the real conflict was just beginning. As coalition forces moved deeper into Iraq, their mission shifted. From invasion to investigation. Teams were deployed to locate weapons of mass destruction. Sites were searched, facilities inspected, intelligence cross-checked, but days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months, and the expected discoveries never came. No stockboats, no active programs, no evidence that matched the urgency that had justified the war. This wasn't just a minor discrepancy. It was a foundational problem, because the primary reason for the invasion was now in question. And as this reality began to surface, the narrative started to fracture. Public confidence weakened, media scrutiny intensified, and critics began asking a question that would define the war's legacy. Was the intelligence wrong, or was it presented in a way that made war inevitable? With the Iraqi government dismantled, a power vacuum emerged. And power vacuums are rarely peaceful. Without strong central control, various groups began competing for influence. Insurgencies formed. Sectarian tensions escalated. Violence became unpredictable. For civilians, daily life transformed into uncertainty. Markets became targets. Roads became dangerous. Trust between communities eroded. For American soldiers, the mission became increasingly complex. It was no longer about defeating a regime. It was about navigating a fragmented, volatile environment where the enemy was not always visible, and where victory was no longer clearly defined. The original expectation was a short conflict, a quick transition, a stable Iraq. But reality moved in a different direction. The war extended year after year. Strategies shifted. Troop levels changed. Policies evolved. But stability remained elusive. The financial cost grew into the trillions. The human cost became immeasurable. And the psychological toll on soldiers, families, and civilians continued to deepen. Because this was no longer just a war. It had become a prolonged struggle with no clear endpoint. The impact of the Iraq War extended far beyond Iraq. It reshaped global dynamics. Allies questioned decisions. Trust between nations shifted, and new power structures began to emerge in the Middle East. Perhaps most significantly, the instability created conditions for extremist groups to rise. Groups that would later become major global threats. This wasn't an intended outcome, but it was a consequence. And in history, consequences often matter more than intentions. Even today, the Iraq War remains one of the most debated conflicts in modern history. Was it a necessary act of defense, or a preventable mistake driven by flawed judgment? Different perspectives offer different answers. Some focus on the context of fear after September 11th. Others focus on the failures of intelligence. And some look at the broader implications of power and decision-making. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect is this. There is no single, universally accepted answer. And that ambiguity is what keeps the debate alive. By 2006, the situation in Iraq had reached a breaking point. Violence was no longer sporadic. It was constant. Sectarian conflict between Sunni and Shia groups had escalated into near civil war. Bombings, assassinations, and daily instability had become part of life. The original mission, to remove a regime and stabilize the region, had transformed into something far more complicated. And inside Washington, pressure was mounting. Criticism was growing louder. Not just from the public, but from within the government itself. It was at this moment that a new strategy emerged. In 2007, under the administration of George W. Bush, the United States launched what would become known as the Surge. An additional 20,000 plus troops were deployed to Iraq. But this wasn't just about numbers. It was about strategy. Instead of focusing solely on eliminating threats, the new approach emphasized protecting civilians, stabilizing neighborhoods, and working directly with local communities. For a moment, it seemed to work. violence levels began to decrease. Certain regions experienced relative stability. Militia influence weakened in some areas. And for the first time in years, there was a sense, however fragile, that progress was possible. But the key word was always this: temporary, because while the surge reduced violence, it did not resolve the deeper issues that had caused the conflict in the first place. By the late 2000s, the conversation began to shift again, not toward escalation, but toward exit. The question was no longer how to win the war. It was how to end it. In 2008, an agreement was reached to begin withdrawing U.S. troops from Iraq. And in 2011, under President Barack Obama, the withdrawal was officially completed. American troops left Iraqi soil. After nearly a decade of war, the mission, on paper, had come to an end. But reality was far more complicated, because while troops were leaving, the consequences of the war remained. Political instability continued. Sectarian divisions persisted, and a fragile balance that had been maintained during the surge began to weaken once again, which led to a question that would define the next phase of the conflict. Did the withdrawal end the war, or simply create space for a new one to begin? The answer came sooner than expected. Out of the instability in Iraq and neighboring Syria, a new force began to emerge. A group that would soon become one of the most feared organizations in modern history: Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. By 2014, ISIS had seized large territories across Iraq. Cities fell rapidly. Governments struggled to respond. And once again, global attention turned back to a region that had never fully stabilized. For many analysts, this moment became a critical turning point, because it forced a difficult realization. The Iraq War hadn't just changed Iraq. It had reshaped the entire regional landscape in ways that were never fully anticipated. The removal of Saddam Hussein had created opportunities, but also vulnerabilities. And in those vulnerabilities, new threats had taken root. Numbers can tell part of the story, but they can never tell all of it. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost during the Iraq War. Millions were displaced. Entire generations grew up in conflict. But behind every statistic is a story. A soldier who never returned home. A family forced to leave everything behind. A child who grew up knowing only instability. For American veterans, the war didn't end in 2011. It continued in memories, in trauma, in the quiet moments long after the battlefield was left behind. For Iraqi civilians, the war reshaped daily life in ways that cannot be easily measured. Because when infrastructure collapses, when trust erodes, when fear becomes routine, the effects linger for decades. And this is the part of war that is often overlooked. Not the strategy, not the politics, but the people. At the beginning of the war, the narrative was clear. Action was necessary. Threats were imminent. The mission was justified. But as the years passed, that narrative began to shift. Journalists uncovered inconsistencies. Reports challenged official claims. Public opinion evolved. What was once widely supported became deeply controversial. And in this shift, another lesson emerged. Control of information shapes perception. Because the Iraq War wasn't just fought on the battlefield. It was also fought in headlines, broadcasts, and public discourse. And as more information became available, the story people believed began to change. Perhaps the most debated aspect of the Iraq War is still the intelligence. How do the world's most advanced intelligence systems fail to accurately assess the presence of weapons of mass destruction? Was it a genuine mistake? A misinterpretation of incomplete data? Or something more intentional? Investigations later revealed a complex reality. Some intelligence was based on unreliable sources. Some conclusions were drawn too quickly, and some warnings, voices urging caution, were not given the attention they deserved. But whether it was failure or bias, the result was the same: a war justified by a threat that was never found. In the years following the Iraq War, policymakers and analysts began reflecting on what went wrong. Lessons were identified, mistakes were acknowledged, strategies were re-evaluated. But the timing of these lessons raised a difficult question. What is the value of a lesson learned after the damage is already done? Because while future decisions may be influenced by past mistakes, the consequences of those mistakes cannot be undone. Lives lost remain lost. Communities disrupted remain changed. And history moves forward, regardless of whether it was understood in time. One of the most lasting impacts of the Iraq War is something less visible, but deeply significant. Distrust. Distrust in intelligence. Distrust in leadership. Distrust in the narratives used to justify major decisions. This distrust didn't stay confined to one country. It spread globally, shaping how future conflicts are perceived, influencing how information is received, and creating a lasting skepticism that still exists today. Because once trust is broken, it is far more difficult to rebuild than it is to lose. Final chapter: a war without a clear ending. So how does the story end? The honest answer is, it doesn't. Because the Iraq War is not a story with a clean conclusion. It doesn't have a definitive final chapter. Instead, it exists as an ongoing narrative, one that continues to influence global politics, military strategy, and public perception. It lives on in policy decisions, in regional instability, in the lives of those who experienced it, and in the questions that still remain unanswered. History is often remembered through dates, headlines, and decisions. But some moments refuse to stay in the past. The Iraq War is one of those moments. Because this wasn't just a conflict measured in strategy or territory. It was a turning point. A moment where fear, power, intelligence, and urgency collided and produced consequences that no one could fully control. Even now, decades later, its shadow remains. Not always visible, but always present. In the policies that are shaped more cautiously. In the questions that are asked more critically. In a hesitation that didn't exist before. Because once a decision of this scale is made, it doesn't simply end. It echoes across governments, across generations, across the lives of people who may never have even seen the battlefield, but still live with its consequences. And maybe that's what makes this story so difficult to close. There is no single moment where everything stops. No clear line where history says, this is where it ends. Because for some, the war ended when the troops left. For others, it ended when the violence slowed. But for many, it never truly ended at all. It continued in memory, in loss, in unanswered questions, and in a lingering sense that something, somewhere, could have gone differently. So what do we take from this? Was it a failure of intelligence? A failure of leadership? Or simply the result of decisions made under impossible pressure? The truth is, it may be all of those things. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part, because it means the line between certainty and mistake is thinner than we like to believe. It means that even the most powerful nations can act on incomplete understanding. And it means that the cost of being wrong can be immeasurable. But history is not just about what happened. It's about what we choose to remember, what we choose to question, and what we choose to learn. Because if stories like this are forgotten, they risk being repeated. And if they're remembered only partially, they risk being misunderstood. So maybe the real ending isn't an answer. Maybe it's a responsibility. a responsibility to look deeper, to question louder, and to never accept certainty without understanding the cost behind it. Because in the end, the Iraq War doesn't just ask us to look back. It asks us to think forward, to imagine a future where decisions are made not just with power, but with clarity, not just with urgency, but with reflection, and not just with certainty, but with the humility to question it. Because sometimes, the most important lesson history leaves behind is not what happened, but how easily it could happen again.